Great crowd.
I'm a little lethargic right now because I just crammed basically the left side of the menu from the pit in me. So I got like the rib sweats right now.
Which sauce did you choose?
All of them. Carolina, Kansas City, Western style.
Mm-hmm. And
they should have, right? And the boots and everything. I could have probably gotten a job there.
all right, so hey guys. So we actually met each other a couple years ago at a conference, and we were on the scavenger hunt team.
That's right.
We did not win, and he was cutting corners like everywhere to give our team an advantage.
That's what I do for a living, is cut corners.
That's right. So Chris, I figured this crowd would know your basic story of how you invested in Twitter early on, and then bought up a bunch of shares, and then and went big with the IPO. But I was doing some research and heard about a lot of these guys are early in their career, and I thought your story about how you turned $10,000 to $12,000 into $12 million in the late '90s.
You can stop right there.
It was a really good story.
Huge success, right?
It was a huge, yeah, and that was the beginning. And I think there was more to that story, though.
Well, yeah, in a matter of a few days in the spring of 2000, I was way over levered into these two stocks. In a matter of a few days, I found myself going from $12 million to the good to $4 million to the bad. So I was 25 years old. I owed $4 million. I didn't have anything to show for it. I didn't have a house or a boat or a plane or anything I could sell to pay it off. I owed it. And I came from a middle-class background. Neither of my parents had ever made more than $100,000 in a year, and I was just stuck. And I had to make some choices then about whether I was going to quit and, or try to declare bankruptcy, or whether I'd try and fight it out. And it happened just as I was graduating law school, actually. And so I said, well, I'm going to try and fight this out, and I'll take a sellout job as a corporate lawyer out at Fenwick and West, and I'll try and grind this out. And so during the day, I would do corporate law stuff at a tech firm, and at night, I would do pretty much anything that somebody would pay me to do, short of giving blood or massages.
Can you use like Craigslist for this?
I did go on Craigslist. I was writing contracts and business plans and renaming companies. There's a thing called Elance out there. There's now like Odesk and Rent-A-Coder and stuff, but Elance was the first of those markets, and I was the first lawyer on Elance. And so I was writing terms and conditions for websites, some of which turned out to be adult websites, but they paid cash. And so I even did a voiceover for a book once. Yeah, who knew? But I actually screamed for a few hours to make my voice super raspy. That was what they were looking for in the character. So, but I just did anything I could to try and pay off this debt. Mm-hmm. And it took me from then till basically the Google IPO, to selling another company in the Google IPO before I got back to zero of net worth. And I'll tell you, no matter how early you are in your career, the richest you will ever feel is when you owe $0 to anybody. That's the very first time in your life when you've got choices. You could go join the Peace Corps, you could go travel the world, you could do anything. I actually celebrated by throwing a BYOB party at my house. Like, I'm not going in the red to treat all you guys. So. But that was a real pivotal moment in my life. I'll tell you, I never really considered any other option. I never considered moving back with my parents to Buffalo, New York. I never considered declaring bankruptcy. I just kind of always knew I would fight my way out of it. And I think that's something that, for those of you who are founders, I'd encourage, not everybody's a founder. It's easy to kind of sign the paperwork, but some of you just aren't founders. And there's a time when you have to admit that to yourself, that it's cool to have a startup, but you may not be a founder. You may not be the kind of unstable, mentally askew person with a slightly manic depressive side who knows in the face of insurmountable odds that you're going to win. And I don't mean as convinced that you can sell people and convince people of that. I mean, you know in your bones that you're going to make it out. And I think that's something that was a little different about me. It was like in that hole, as advisors were saying, look, just go BK, and 7 years from now you can walk away from it. I just knew I would fight my way out of it. And I didn't have to convince myself or anybody else. As we look at our very best founders historically, and by the way, I brought my partner, Matt, here. He's back there in the fancy lowercase vest. So he's the one who actually runs our fund.
Pitch him instead of Chris.
He's the pitch, yeah. I stepped back from our seed fund a couple years ago. He runs it. But we've actually gone back and tried to look at all of our best investments and what made them the best investments. And without a doubt, they're all like, okay, it ends up being about the founder. I think a lot of people, a lot of VCs are like product or founder or team or there's a lot of bullshit out there. But we decided, we've had the most successful seed portfolio ever, so we went back and said, all right, why did it work? And what we found was the common thread among all of our founders that kicked total ass is that when you talk to them, even their initial pitch, there is this absolute inevitability of their success. It's just palpable. They're not actually selling you. They're not trying to convince you of anything. They're just there relating a story and sharing with you the journey they're going to be on. And you just get this sense that the train's leaving the station, you better get involved. And so I think back to Kevin Systrom, the founder of Instagram. Kevin's an amazing guy, brilliant guy, really creative guy. Hand-coded a lot of those filters originally. I mean, he's got a fancy team now and stuff, but he was not only a fan of photography, but he was enough of a coder that he built those filters. But the first time I met with him and sat down and talked about Instagram, he said just in passing at one point, and so when we get to 50 million users, we'll kind of layer in this other thing. And I was like, stop right there. You are sitting alone in a co-working space in San Francisco right now. Like, you are working from your own desk surrounded by all these other startups. How the hell do you say 50 million users, right? And it didn't even occur to him that he had said it, because he wasn't trying to smoke and mirror me into doing a deal. He just knew Instagram was going to be huge, and he was the one to make it huge, right? Travis Kalanick in the earliest days of Uber was staying at my house up in the mountains in Truckee, and back then, Travis was already talking with us in our kitchen about how Uber would not just move cars around, it would move anything around. It would move bits around, atoms around, food around, packages around. Like, Travis was still staying in hostels when he traveled with a half-full backpack, and Uber probably had 3 cars in the network at the time. But we had already started anticipating regulatory battles across the world. In fact, a lot of people don't realize this, but the Uber's third city, do you know what it was? So it was San Francisco, New York. Do you know what the third city was?
No, I don't remember.
It was Paris, because it was just going to be the hardest one, right? Who does that? You're like, wait, we could mop up in LA and Houston has a huge black car market. We could go to Chicago right now. And he's just like, no, let's take it right to Paris right now. Well, we're like, wait, there are 6 people who work here and we're going to go launch in Paris. That's the kind of maniac he is. And so as we look across all of our, whatever you call them, unicorns or whatever, that's something that we see in common. And so I think if your founders here, gut check, like, are you that kind of person? Do you feel like you're constantly convincing the people around you and yourself? Or do you feel like you really just know, right up until the point it fails, you know it's going to succeed? But do you just know that this thing is going to win? Because if so, what you'll find is the other people on your team just find that magnetic. They gravitate towards you. Fundraising becomes less about trying to pitch, and just sweat and sell, and it becomes more about you start interviewing the people who you want involved in your company, and you're giving them the chance. I mean, we always use this lexicon in venture capital, like, as a founder, you say, these VCs gave us $3 million. Well, bullshit, they didn't give you anything. They're not a charity. It's not a magnanimous act. You gave them the opportunity to buy your stock. And in doing so, you made a decision that the remainder of your stock that you have left is going to be worth more as a consequence of having them involved. And so if you start thinking like this and carry yourself that way, it's inevitable that you'll win. But if you're not that person, just join another company. And I think we have this environment right now where I get a little worried because there's been so much money out there.
Right.
It's been so easy for people to start companies. It's so damn fashionable, and Justin Timberlake might play you in a movie someday or something. So everybody's out there trying to do it, and a lot of these people just aren't that person. They're good people, they're hustlers, they're hard workers, but they're not the founder. And I'd love to see some of these people join forces more.
Do you think we're on the verge of another bubble?
Absolutely, but it's not as nasty as the last one. I mean, 1999, 2000, I don't know if anyone here was working back then, but that was a disgrace because there was an abundance of cash, and there was no business underlying any of it, right? And so that's why the outcome was so damn binary. It just went from a lot to zero overnight. There was also a lot of greater fool theory stuff there where it's just like each time you raised a round, you're just like, let's get us to the IPO. And the VCs back then were all former investment bankers. And the most important people in Silicon Valley were iBankers too, because the only real exit was sell this thing to Wall Street.
Right.
And that was a whole pull the wool over the eyes of the public investor. And so it was just like a shit rolls downhill, let's see how quick we can get out of the hot potato thing. And that's why it just totally collapsed and evaporated. It got so bad in Silicon Valley back then that you couldn't get a U-Haul out of Silicon Valley. They'd all gone one way to, Biloxi and stuff. Everyone went home, and you were just stuck there. Just put your shit on the curb. But this time around, we have real businesses, right? I mean, people who are starting stuff aren't starting just as much on a wing and a prayer. Sure, there's some social stuff that knows if they get enough attention, they'll ultimately be able to maybe capture that and monetize it. But there's a lot of stuff with a real model there. Contributory margins are pretty shitty among a lot of them. A lot of people just think they can spend their way into some share at some point. Lyft comes to mind. But there are businesses that are intrinsically businesses. And I think with some tweaks, they could turn the corner. I do believe that the IPO window has closed. When you see public companies, I mean, Twitter with a $3 billion run rate is trading at $8 billion net cash right now. Square just got its ass handed to it. It's below its IPO price. That window is closed, and so what that does is it dominoes down through the rest of the market.
Are you still buying Twitter shares?
I'm neutral on Twitter shares right now because I own more than I should. I don't.
What do you think the future is? They've hit some rough patches.
You think? I mean, that company shot itself in the face 8 or 9 times since its birth. It's not just Harvard Business Review case studies. It's Harvard Business Review therapy manuals. God damn. But no, the outlook. So they have a unique asset, which is they have more and better and more diverse information than anyone on the planet, and they have it first. They have more than Google when it comes down to real time. Google crawls their index and finds that only 62% of the links within Twitter were ever found by the Google spider. So you've got almost half of the content there has never been seen by Google, and that's what Google makes its business doing, right?
Right.
And they've got it all first. You've all seen it. They got it 45 minutes before the news usually. They've got something that everybody in this room here would care about, whether it's sports or politics or entertainment and celebrities or your weird hobby or mathematics or planetary science or whatever it is, it's in there. They just do an awful job of getting that to you. They do an awful job of surfacing that to, and I'm sure there are a lot of power users of Twitter in here who know how to tweak it and search and set up your lists and all that stuff, but normals don't.
Do you think Periscope is going to be their savior?
No. I was optimistic for Periscope for a long time, but I think Periscope, Twitter to me is kind of the epitome of something that is built in the echo chamber. Mm-hmm. It's funny.
In Silicon Valley.
Everyone who works at Twitter is a power user of Twitter.
Right.
And so you kind of forget what it's like to be a new user to Twitter and how much it sucks, how hard it is. Mm-hmm. I mean, do you ever go to the logged out new user page of Twitter? It's amazing now. So they basically surface the best tweets on the network right now in real time. And you'll see a fun tweet from The Rock. Well, I'm not going to follow The Rock, but if The Rock has a tweet that was retweeted 106,000 times, it's probably pretty cool. And it's probably something, if you're just an American, generally you might give a shit about, right? Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny, the minute you create a Twitter account, you never see that page again. What the hell? There's really great content there. And I'm blown away by, there was a picture of Andy Roddick put his arm around some other tennis player and some other tennis player. And again, I don't care enough about tennis to follow these guys, but to know that these, arch rivals are there hugging it out, it was just a pretty cool cultural literacy moment that I'd love to see, right? I'd love to see the best tweets from Kobe's last night of playing, even though I'm not going to follow everyone in the goddamn NBA who's tweeting about Kobe, but Twitter just does a really poor job of getting those in front of you, as interesting as they are. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that kills me. Periscope has done an incredible job of surfacing wildly diverse content there, from a guy who chases forest fires to Benjamin Millepied, who's the director of the Paris Ballet, and he's walking in and out of the dancers while they're rehearsing, to somebody who's embedded with the Syrian refugees as they make their way across borders and stuff. All that's super cool. But again, let's throw it back to The Rock. If that dude wants to Periscope from the Hollywood red carpet, fucking promote it, man. Just put it in front of everybody. Most people care about that, right? And I think there's been a real failure to embrace celebrity and persona and the gravity of big events there and mainstream. And so I think they've got a very cool product. One of the product lessons, by the way, from Periscope that I've noticed is notifications. You know, notifications are a relatively new phenomenon when you're building apps now. And I think people take for granted how delicately you have to treat the privilege of notification. Like, Periscope is something that has to happen live to really enjoy it as much as you should. But that means you're going to interrupt people a lot. And if you interrupt people too much, they're going to turn your shit off.
Right.
And I think what happened with Periscope is that there was a lot of fatigue. And of course, Apple doesn't pass the information on, so the app builder never knows. But I think there was a lot of fatigue with those notifications, and I've seen audiences come down. So I don't know what the exact answer is. Maybe it's build more scheduling into your app. I think Periscope would do better if they just let people sign up for a specific broadcast, specific time. I also think they'd do better if they just let the goddamn replays happen, you know, instead of doing #save. So, you know, I think I got Tyra Banks to show her new haircut on Periscope. 24 hours later, it was gone. Well, it's still goddamn cute if you saw it today, but that was a year and a half ago and nobody can see it. We got David Blaine's an old buddy. We got him to do magic tricks that would still blow your mind, but they're gone. And I just think some of these things are features that are cool within the bubble, but really don't reflect a great understanding of normals.
Yep. So you've talked about, I remember reading this about Salinger Group, which is, which I'd like to hear you talk about that, but it was basically how you that epitomized fake it till you make it. But you've recently also talked about the importance of vulnerability and how being vulnerable is what attracts people to you. Can you talk about the balance of those two things?
Yeah, so by way of background, when I lost all that money, broke on my ass. I was able to negotiate the $4 million down to $2 1/8 because they were worried I was going to go bankrupt, et cetera. So I had to pay off $2 1/8 million, which I guess growing up felt like an insane amount of money to me. And I had to pay it off with nothing to show for it. It wasn't like a fancy house. I just had to pay it. So I'm doing all these scrappy jobs. I'm working at this law firm. And then 4 days before September 11th, I'm laid off from my law firm along with my whole incoming class. And we were laid off because revenues at the law firm were down 7%. So God forbid you keep a bunch of people around. Anyway. So for 4 days, I had amazing job prospects. I was talking to VeriSign and Excited Home and all these cool companies. And then September 11th happens, and it's just everything stops. And so I had a business card that said Chris Sacca, attorney at law. And I went to every networking event I could go to, handing out this card, and people were like, hey man, you sound like a good kid. Things will work out for you, and give me the old hair tussler pat on the back. And I'm like, fuck, I need to make rent like this week. So I came up with this idea. I came up with this consultancy called the Salinger Group. And my now wife, then my best friend, she designed me a logo that looked pretty badass. I got somebody on Elance to make me a website that said a lot of nothing. You can go, I let the domain lapse a long time ago, but you can go see the website in the Wayback Machine, archive.org, and you'll see it says nothing in a lot of words. It doesn't have an address there because I lived in a shitty apartment in Foster City, California. It doesn't have a phone number because I didn't have, there weren't even virtual mailboxes then, so it was just get in touch. And we had 3 divisions: venture capital, media, and consulting. So, and it was partly for me. I would go to these networking events and I'd hand people my card and it said Chris Sacca, principal of the Salinger Group, and people would be like, oh yeah, I've heard of you guys. You guys do good work. We could use your help around that. I'm like, fuck yeah. But then I had a bunch of other buddies who were all unemployed who were like, hey man, do you mind if I say I work at the Salinger Group? I'm like, go right ahead, what's your email address? And so we would fire this up. I mean that, by the way, even after, we'll get to how my career turned around, but even after that, I still had buddies. That was just a bleak time for anyone in our space. Men, women, and children just running for the exits. It was bad. And so I had a bunch of people with gaps in their resumes who came back later and were like, hey, I'm getting back into the job force. Can I just say I worked at the Salinger Group? I'm like, just let me know what your title was and we'll get that all squared away. So So it was, I kind of cast a wider net. It wasn't just looking out for myself. But yeah, that became a real thing. In fact, there are more steps. I went from there. One of my first clients hired me. They're a company called Spidera. Their main competitor, Akamai, was constantly trying to put them out of business. And one day, I had the FBI raid their offices on a trumped-up charge of hacking, computer fraud and abuse. And so they called me and were like, we think we're going to need you to start working here full-time. And so I went in there, got the CTO out of jail, and defended those cases, and we ended up, Akamai gave up eventually and bought us for $330 million. But I ended up at Google, and at Google, I was doing all this top secret shit, so they didn't want me to tell anyone I worked there, so they actually bought the Sounder Group for $1. And so I rolled around and bought all these data centers and stuff like that as the Sounder Group still, so it lived. Somewhere it's in the annals of that company.
So
but you wanted me to talk about the balance of like that versus vulnerability. Well, it's tough because when you've failed, so when you've overextended your credit and lost millions of dollars in your own name, and you have only your own hubris to point to, when you landed the kick-ass best, 7th best place in America to work job, and then you get laid off from there 13 months later, and you're out on your ass, barely making it work, it's hard to be vulnerable, right? Mm-hmm. It's hard to admit that failure. When we talk about Silicon Valley as being a culture that embraces failure, they tend to embrace it after you've already succeeded. Irony, right? But the vulnerability part comes from a lesson I had back when I was at Google. My first job where I actually had a big group, I had a mandate. Larry Page had given me a bunch of money to go fuck with the wireless carriers. And you might remember we went to the FCC auction with $4.7 billion to kind of play this huge hand of poker / chicken to get them to buy all this spectrum. But we had to have a game face and keep them real. We did all this game theory and stuff. But to give a 30-year-old $4.7 billion to go literally just try and stare down Lowell McAdam was pretty ballsy. Mm-hmm. And not a lot of companies would do that. But as I was building the group around it, at Google there's a tradition of note-taking where instead of it being a secretarial function, one of the most important people in the room's job is to take the notes and project the notes while we're talking so that everyone in the room can agree this is the knowledge that was created and transferred during the meeting. And at the end of the meeting, you hit send. And those notes go immediately to anybody in the company who subscribes to the notes from that meeting. Mm. And so my partner on the project, she wrote, Chris doesn't know what to do about this. And then hit send. And when I saw the notes later, I'm like, what the fuck? You just ruined me. Everyone's going to know. I don't know what the hell to do right now, right? And I also have, she actually was my girlfriend at the time too, so that was even worse. We were like living together. I'm like, ah. So I came to the meeting the next week, and there were 6 new people in there who all thought they knew the answer to that question and wanted to help, and one of them was Larry Page. Mm. He subscribed. I was so worried that Larry Page would see I didn't know what I was doing, he'd fire me or something, and instead he came to the meeting, and he helped out. And I kind of looked around the room. I remember about 15 minutes in after getting over the initial shock, and I was like, hey, I just got more powerful. And I was like, by admitting, against my will, that I needed help, like all these people just showed up to work for me for free. This is amazing. And it was an incredible lesson. And so that was the vulnerability, I think, that what you're touching on is I've now developed this code that we use in our own organization as well as with our founders we call bold humility. You read all these business books that are trying to teach you to be humble. And frankly, I just think for kick-ass people, humility is not a natural state. It's not the default. To constantly have to edge off of the things that you're fucking good at, right? Like anyone here who probably did well in school or did well enough to skip school or started something or is like, you're probably amazing at some subset of skills. You're probably good at coding, good at math, good at convincing other people to come hang out with you. You're probably a good recruiter, good salespeople, whatever it is. But most of us are bad at more things than we're the best at. Right? And so what it came down to for us, I was like, look, let's not apologize for the things we're the best at. And you're going to hear me. There's some conceit in my storytelling, my voice, because I'm fucking great at some things, and I'm not going to apologize for it. But on the other hand, where we all get tripped up is where we feel like to be leaders, to have followers, to have people join our companies, to get up in front of people and inspire them, we have to pretend like we've got it all covered and we got it all figured out. And so what we really work hard on with ourselves and our companies is finding that line where you're not the best at something and somebody else is. And when you ask them for that, when you express that, when you show that openness to help, to somebody bringing something to the table, they feel great. They feel valued and acknowledged and part of it. And it's what gets people to stay late. It's what gets people to work for free. It's what gets people to think about you when they're not at work and keep hustling all through the weekend and all the time. It's what makes people feel like owners. And that was a huge lesson for us. And I think at that point, my career shifted and just accelerated to where I just said, look, I can feel good about the things I do, and I'm not even here to convince you I'm good at them. I just fucking know it. But if I don't really identify where I need help and empower all of you to be those helpers, then we're going nowhere.
You're talking a lot about accepting help, but you've also written a lot about how you offering your help to others without accepting anything in return or giving value before you accept anything in return has also been something that's really worked well for you.
Yeah, I mean, look, it wasn't an original idea. I mean, Matt and I aren't philosopher kings about this. We a lot of it is regression analysis. It's like, all right, well, a bunch of this worked. Why did it work? And let's see if we can identify some pattern. And you don't want confirmation bias, but you want to see, like, why did this work? And so I started looking at some of our first, they ended up kind of picking us because somebody told me a cool idea and I got excited and we had a jam session, started really talking about it. And then I just started showing up. Before I had any money in the company, before we'd ever had a conversation about a deal, I was just there helping, right? So PhotoBucket was my very first angel investment. So I don't know how many of you use PhotoBucket, but it was kind of like the very beginning of the link economy, and it was the way you would post an image on anywhere on the web, but specifically eBay a lot. And what was interesting was 80% of PhotoBucket was essentially Spidera, my content delivery network. It was the same architecture, the same kind of problems, the same kind of compression. And compression is funny now, thinking about Silicon Valley and Pied Piper, but it was something we actually used to work on. Compression did matter at one time.
What do you think about that show?
It's dead on. That's the problem. It's not as funny anymore because they can't keep ahead of Silicon Valley. It's more a documentary than a humor show. And that's